Welcome everybody to our cloud meetup in the great Autodesk gallery. My name is Danny Ryan, along with Peter Jones. We're the organizers of this meetup. This meetup has been run internally in Autodesk over the last 9 months, and we decided we'd grow it up and put it on meetup.com and make it more of an invitation to anybody to come and take part in it. And I'm looking for Peter. Mr. Jones in the house? Okay. So definitely this is supposed to be a place for people from different companies to meet, talk about problems, talk about solutions. We will encourage anybody who's here who wants to in future, here we go, have a topic, come and talk to us. We'd be very happy to talk to you. Peter.
Let me at least say hello. Thank you. What he said, though. Right? This is a meetup about cloud builders, people that are building clouds, working on it from different technologies. So we wanted to talk about a lot of different topics. One of the first ones is, who am I? How do I get authenticated? Which, of course, is about identity. So that's where we're starting, but we want to take this in a lot of different directions. So please, if you have ideas about topics or you want to speak yourself, contact us afterwards, and we're building sort of a pipeline for different topics. But without further ado, Morteza, let me pass the baton over to him. Morteza is graciously coming here from, he works at Cisco right now, but he's been in a lot of different places, very active in the identity space, and we thought we would have a great conversation about identity. So kind of gauge this, it can be interactive, et cetera, but Morteza, let me give it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, folks. Come on, people, come closer. We have plenty of chairs here, come on. This is gonna be an interactive session. This is not formal, so get closer so you can ask questions. We can sort of talk about the stuff that you want to talk about. This is really about having fun, learning something new, especially me learning something from you guys. So please interrupt anytime you want. If you get bored, let me know. I'll sort of switch topics, move on to something else. But this is really sort of, I'm here to sort of try to give you a little bit of my experiences, the stuff that I've done in the identity space on security authentication stuff. So most of you guys are too young to know the days that computers didn't need to worry about identity. I thought about this and sort of went back to punch cards in the sort of the old days. Pretty much ever since then, identity became part of it. Even in the days of VAX, IBM sort of virtual machines, which sort of we recently discovered again a few years ago as part of VMware. Ever since that stuff happened, we've always dealt with some sort of identity. It's sort of gone up and down a little bit. It was major when we sort of logged in through VT100s to VAXs and IBM virtual machines. It got less important when we got into Windows and DOS and whatnot, and then it got more important as sort of cloud technologies took over. But these days, there is absolutely nothing you can do if you don't sort of deal with some sort of identity authentication authorization, even if that identity is lack of identity, which is guest user notion, but you still have to deal with that in some way. In around 90s, pretty much any project that I saw anybody started by creating a database table for users and password. And typically when you start a project, I've never ever seen a project that started by saying, hey, we've got to sort of get the right identity guys and start thinking about the identity and let's build that part of it. Typically what happened, you took the most junior person and said, go figure this thing out. And if you were lucky, they basically built that sort of password table. If you were lucky and they were sort of security conscious, they hashed the password. If you were really lucky, they salted that hash. That's about it. That's how we got into the mess that we're in today with hundreds of identities and hundreds of passwords that we have for every one of us. Last 2-3 years, things have been changing for the better, thank God. It's about time, but we still have a lot of legacy baggage that we have to deal with. So we're here to talk about some of these problems. So what do we talk about? What do we mean when we talk about identity management? Number one, the most important part is the provisioning, lifecycle management of the identity. How do you create an identity? How do you evolve it? How do you modify it? How do you change it? People's last name changes, email addresses changes, various attributes about them change, and you have to sort of go through that life cycle, and eventually, probably the most important one is deprovisioning of it once you're done with some sort of identity that you have to deal with. So that's the provisioning lifecycle piece of it. Oops, too many. That's where the beer is showing up. Authentication is the next piece. You have to deal with sort of, once you have provisioned some sort of identity, you have to be able to sort of authenticate that identity so that you can say, this is truly Morteza that's coming into the system. Another one that's a little bit newer, but it's absolutely key part of it, at least in my point of view, and I was talking to some of you guys about this, is entitlement. As the days of a single company, a single product, a single solution, a single service is long sort of over now. And every company has multiple services, multiple sort of offering. I don't know how many Autodesk has, but I would imagine it's more than dozens. You have to be able to deal with this dynamic sort of, with this entitlement, and you have to deal with it in a dynamic fashion. You can't have customers that have 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 users and be able to go and say, oh, I'm gonna make Morteza entitled to this service and that service and not the other service. And tomorrow Morteza's role changes from engineering to marketing or go the management route or whatnot, and then manually go and change those things. It has to be dynamic, it has to be based on a policy, it has to be based on attributes about Morteza that drives that entitlement. So that's absolutely key, which is why entitlement is a core piece of the identity infrastructure. Last, certainly not least, is authorization. This is an area that I think in general in the industry we failed miserably. Over the last 20 years, we have not really solved the authorization problem properly. Nobody has solved it. I gave a talk at CIS, Cloud Identity Summit, last year or the year before, and I actually, the topic was about that failure, and I had people that sort of, CEOs of various authorization companies coming up to me and telling me, oh, how wrong I am and how sort of, incorrect it is, and we've solved this. And I gave them examples of, do you have a solution that sort of can solve authorization problem for 100 million users, multi-billion objects, about a couple of 100,000 policies, and I need a response in less than 30, 25, 30 milliseconds? They just, not really. Okay, come back and tell me when you've done it, but generally we fail at this. Entitlement is a special case of authorization, but this is sort of, what I actually break it down as personally is medium level authorization, sort of mid-grain, not fine grain, sort of saying, do you have access to this specific photo, but do you have access to the class of photos type of thing. That typically belongs into the identity subsystem. The very fine grain authorization typically is at the service level, at the application level, because only the application can deal with that scale and that sort of semantic much better than sort of the central system can. And then obviously policy that sort of sits around how you manage all of these things. How long is an authentication valid for? Once you create a session, how long is that authentication valid for? Is that authentication mobile from one data center, from one application to another application? Who has access to update last name of the user? Who has access to update the picture of avatar of the user? All of those policies are sort of, that really sort of brings this together as a cohesive system and makes it manageable and sort of palatable to the customers of the system, which is, by the way, most of the stuff I'm talking about is enterprise, given that I imagine that most of your audience is enterprise, though I'm sure there's some consumer stuff as well. By the way, how many people are Autodesk employees? All right, let me re-ask it. How many people are not Autodesk employees? Okay, cool.
Go us.
Yay, I'm one of you guys. So a little bit of talking about the consumer side of it. Huge scale. Facebook, as of, I looked this up this afternoon, 1.3 billion active users, and they define it every month, sort of they actually get into Facebook one time as of September. That's interesting, but the really interesting is the insane growth. Instagram went from launching their app to getting to 150 million users in less than 3 years. I mean, think about sort of, in the 90s when we were talking about identity systems, 20,000 users in it was, wow, that's the biggest identity system I worked on in mid-90s. And now we're talking about 150 million. So what this means is, if you build some solution in the cloud, and, well, if you fail, who cares? It's not gonna get any adoption. But if you actually do a good job and it gets adoption, you're not gonna have time to go redo it. You're not gonna have time to go re-architect it, you're not gonna have time to go rebuild it, because you originally built it so that it handles 10,000 users, and now you sort of, all of a sudden, you got, somebody covered you, and then now you've got, 150 million users that you have to deal with. So you have to start thinking about some of these problems ahead of time, make sure that the stuff that, all the cloud stuff, right? Scalable, dynamic, you can actually grow it, all that stuff needs to be sort of, built into it as we go through. Typically on the consumer side, identities are self-managed. I go to Facebook, create myself an identity, and I'm responsible for managing it. There's no central management, there's nobody else that does it on my behalf. Typically, obviously not always. Namespace problems are very simple on the consumer side. You as the provider of it, come up with some sort of a model, good or bad, whatever is your application that needs, you deal with it. You decide its email address, you decide it's a namespace, first person that grabs Joe gets Joe identity. But you control it, so it's pretty simple. Next one is key. Up to maybe even now some companies still think identity is their business. They think it actually has value for them, which is really, identity doesn't really drive adoption. If you screw it up, it hampers adoption and it causes major problems for you, but it by itself, identity is not the commodity. What's commodity is attributes about your service related to that identity, but not the core identity, which is sort of, why you're starting to see people kind of saying, you know what, I actually rather not deal with the liability of having identities and credentials. I'm just going to point to Google. Those guys have a huge number of people dealing with this. I'll just kind of point to them and use their identities. But then my value is in my attributes, in my service, in my sort of, pieces of it that goes into that identity. So that's pretty key. And it's really sort of, this is a challenge dealing with, from engineers dealing with business people, because that keeps coming back. And then obviously sort of, you got to deal with recovery, people forget their accounts, passwords, usernames. Even if you do delegate it, sort of, use an external identity provider like Google, you still have to deal with some of these things because people forget, did I sign up to your site using my Facebook account or did I use my Google account? So you still have to have some notions of having the ability to sort of, go back and deal with the recovery. And if you store the credentials, obviously you have to manage that as well. Any questions, by the way? As I said, this is open flow. If you guys kind of don't care about anything I say, if you disagree, please stand up to the mic and talk. Nobody says anything. You guys need more beer. Enterprise identity.
I have a question real quick.
Please, go ahead.
What are some of the issues?
There are mics where I can repeat for you. That if everybody gets closer,
Hello?
you don't have to do that.
Check. Hello? Hello?
No. Yep. What, if any, issues are there, from your perspective, of adopting a Facebook or a Google identity management system? Whether it's from branding to reliability to having to share information, what kind of issues?
Do customers fear about giving up their credentials? Yes.
All of above, actually. It really depends on what is it that you're building, right? It really depends on what is it that you're trying to protect. If you go and tell an enterprise to secure the collaboration that the board meeting uses to decide on which company to buy, which is a major sort of, secret and you have to protect it, is a totally different story than you have a public site that you have a comment that people can comment on your blog, right? So it really depends on what your requirements are. It really depends on, generally speaking, with a major vendor, reliability is not an issue, or at least let's put it this way, you'll be lucky if you spin up a cloud that's going to be as reliable as Facebook or Google, right? So if you're using the major guys like Twitter, Facebook, Google, you're not worried too much about the SLA or the uptime. But you do worry about, is this good enough? Is that sort of, self-assertion of identity sufficient for me to sort of, try to build my infrastructure on it? So it really depends on your business and your application.
From a business, at Autodesk at least, we tend to be more B2B. And I think in that environment, using your Google or your Facebook feels a little too consumer.
Connection with knowing your customer. you use Facebook?
I actually, I don't agree with that. I think, again, it kind of goes back to my previous comment about sort of, identity is commodity, you don't really need to worry about that. Because at the end of the day, you get some sort of set of attributes and some set of assertion coming back from whoever the identity provider is, and then you trust that level, and then you build up the rest. So your customer identity, your relationship with the customer is gonna be something that's gonna be stored in your infrastructure, not in Google anyways. Well, unless you're a Google app that sort of, is running on Google infrastructure. But generally speaking, you control that. So I don't think that's a big concern, but it is definitely, again, it really depends on what you're doing, which is the problem with identity stuff is there's a million ways of doing it and there's no right or wrong. It really depends on what is it that you're doing and to what level. And I'll talk about it a little bit later, please.
But I think perhaps what she's talking about there is the way that if when you build your own identity system, if you say base it off of your customer's email address, you automatically get his or her email address to have a relationship with. But if you outsource that to Facebook, you don't get his email address. You have to ask separately for that if you want it, and which seems funky for the customer. And so.
But again, that goes back into the business decision of, is Facebook the right place if Facebook is not gonna give you? Or it might be enough of a sort of deterrent that when I ask for Facebook, I'm gonna need to ask for these three things, and the user might sort of, resist in giving
Well,
it, which becomes a business decision on your side.
Personally speaking, if the authentication request for me is for Facebook, I almost always say no because I'm terrified it's going to post ridiculous stuff all over my page, right?
Mm-hmm. Question? I'm glad you guys are participating. This is wonderful, awesome.
Folks in the back. This question is coming from a identity amateur, but I did grow up in Burlington, Ontario, so McMaster. There we go.
Yay! I went to Hamilton and sort of,
Yeah, go Marauders. My question is this whole identity conversation, is the main concern security? Is that why we're having it?
Security is obviously a key part of it. Yeah, I mean, you can boil it down to security. I mean, it's such a broad sort of terms that could capture all kind of thing, right? But yeah, I mean, a lot of it, like authentication, authorization, audit trail, all of that stuff falls into some branch of security. So yeah. All right. On the enterprise side, role-based is absolutely key. Again, I sort of used the example already on the entitlement stuff. That's a perfect example of it. My last sort of project that I worked on was the identity for the Cisco collaboration product. We have WebEx, we have IAM, we have telepresence that's sort of, higher end to lower end. We've got VoIP solutions, we've got social, we've got all sort of different products. And typically the customers don't want to pay for everything for every employee. Engineers don't necessarily need to deal with sort of, some other aspects of it. They don't need to host meetings, for example, right? So what they want to do is set up so that the entitlements to the IAM is everybody, every employee, full-time employee of the company, but they want to set the WebEx for the marketing people, for example, right? I'm just making this up, obviously. But, or a real example was we had a customer in Paris office that had upgraded their router infrastructure that they could do high definition video. So they wanted to set up a policy that said everybody in the Paris office can do high definition video on WebEx, but all the other offices, I don't want them to do it because it takes the network down, right? So those are dynamic, right? Those are the type of things that's really about roles and about attributes that are sort of coming as part of the identity system that says something about the user. What is their location? What is their address? What is their title? What is their type of role? What is the job that they have? And all of those things sort of roll into those policies. So that's absolutely key. And the larger the organization is, the more important that part is. Obviously, enterprises demand more security. Facebook, you go there, you get some sort of a EULA from them. You either read it, or most people don't even read it. You accept it, and then that's it. You get what you get. When it comes to enterprises, you can't say that to a multi-million-dollar account. You have to give them some level of knowledge, some level of control for what they need. They want to control how long their sessions are for WebEx differently than IAM, or for Autodesk product A versus product B. I don't know your product line, so I'm not going to sort of try to guess that. Federation is absolutely key. Enterprises don't want to deal with password solve some of that, reduce some of those costs. Internally at Cisco, it costs every single employee $360 a year for password management alone. Just to give you, this number came from our IT department. Just to give you an example. Imagine if we didn't support Federation and you had to do a password for Salesforce, a password for this, a password for that, a password for that. A password reset would be a nightmare. It would be hundreds of dollars, not, well, thousands of dollars probably. Namespace gets a lot more complex because now you're talking about administrative boundaries. You're talking about a tenancy, that's a set of users that are managed by an entity, and then you have the namespace of the tenant, and then you have the namespace of the users within that tenant. What are you gonna do? Are you gonna go with the email address and a global namespace? Are you gonna go with a sort of a tenant plus sort of, user namespace? These becomes sort of, secondary decisions that on the enterprise gets more complex that you have to deal with. Multiple identifiers. I don't wanna sort of spend an hour talking about the difference between identity and identifier, but to give you an example, we have products in the collaboration side of Cisco that have identifiers. Oh, by the way, I'm not speaking on behalf of Cisco. This is a personal talk, so whatever I say is no reflection of the company. I'm not speaking on behalf of Cisco. This is all my personal views. And I'm not speaking on behalf of ITF, given that I have to sort of, say that disclaimer as well. All right, multiple identifiers. If you're using Jabber protocol to do IAM, the JID, the Jabber identity, the Jabber ID is your identifier. If you go into WebEx, it's a different identifier. So even though you have a single identity that you log in and you get access to these services, you still have to have multiple identifier underneath, and you might have multiple of those identifiers per subsystem. So it starts to get more complex on the enterprise side for that. Again, your product line might not need that, but it depends. It really depends on what you're doing. The sort of account tenant validation becomes a little bit more tricky. On the consumer side, it's very easy. Once you decide that, oh, I'm just gonna send them an email, if they have access to that inbox, that means that I verified their identity. For the enterprises and the sort of, this side of the world, it gets a little bit trickier, right? Sometimes you need to pre-provision identities that you can't even sort of send them an email yet because the employee hasn't even started it, right? But they still need to sort of start receiving or having content and whatnot. So this gets a little bit tricky, and then join and split, sort of, my personal nightmare, because companies buy and sell divisions all the time, and you have to be able to take a tenant, join it with another one, take a tenant, split it up, and be able to deal with that process as on an ongoing basis, and it needs to be automated. It's not a one-off, it happens all the time. Once you have enough customers, it's every hour you deal with that. When you mix the consumer and enterprise identity, things get even a little bit more tricky and a little bit more interesting, right? Imagine you sign up to Box with your work email address. So joe@autodesk.com goes and signs up for Box. Then Autodesk IT goes and buys an account for Autodesk. What happens to your identity? What happens to your content, right? You uploaded pictures of your grandma to Box. What happens to that? Who gets to control that? Who gets to decide what is that process of going from a consumer identity to an enterprise identity? And if you're insane, going from enterprise to the consumer, because that gets even more tricky, right? And then not only is identity data, but also sort of, I may choose to sort of create my box with my email address, but call myself Homer instead of Morteza. What happens when Cisco takes over, right? Now Cisco, it's not acceptable for Morteza to go and say, I'm John Chambers, right? So it becomes who controls the attributes of that identity, and it gets kind of tricky. We talked about the data. Namespace gets even more complex. Now you have to sort of merge up the consumer namespace and the enterprise namespace, and how do you manage it, and how do you manage the life cycle of it when sort of the changes occur. And then account recovery, all the shebang that goes around it, multiple identifiers, so this kind of gets crazy. When you sign for your Box account with sort of, your Autodesk, what if you sort of also sign with that another sort of alias on that same account as another identifier with joe@gmail.com? So what happens when Autodesk takes over? What happens with that identifier, right? So again, there's a lot of questions and a lot of flows that you need to think through. Okay, enough of high-level stuff. Well, this is high-level too. Actually, the whole talk is high-level. So this is a typical what you've seen. I'm sure you guys already have this implementation. I was talking to some of you guys, and I sort of, you already have some of this already. Actually, you even have the next slide. Typically, you have some sort of on-prem infrastructure that the customer has. HR data comes in for employees, feeds their identity management infrastructure. If you're lucky, they have some sort of IDP, SAML typically, that they already deployed. And then you really sort of have your own service in the cloud, and you want to sort of have applications and then the client's using it. How do you do it? Most common case that you see everywhere, pretty much everybody has something like this. You get some sort of some people call it connector, we call it connector at Cisco, Salesforce calls it a bridge, Ping calls it a bridge, and Azure calls it something else, I can't remember right now. Google calls it data connector, whatnot. Something that gets deployed on-prem, interfaces with the identity management, possibly with the too many beers, I guess. Identity provider, and takes care of the authentication flows potentially, or at least deals with the provisioning side of the problem and deprovisioning, because deprovisioning is absolutely key for legal reasons for a lot of businesses, because if they need to prove that as soon as somebody gets fired or leave the company, I disable their accounts or at least stop them from having access to that data. And that's deprovisioning is the biggest problem that they have to deal with. And typically, some customers at the lower end, you might not even have this. You can always go there and create a user account for WebEx. You can actually create an account, a tenant, and then go to the UI and create users manually, and then they can sort of have passwords, and you don't have any of this. But again, any customer that has sizable sort of data, that's not obviously going to work. No IT is going to go sit down and type in 10,000 users, and by the time they finish it, it's all out of date anyways. The second use case is kind of the cloud to cloud, which I was talking to you guys. You guys apparently do this, well, Autodesk people, not the rest of you guys, with Salesforce, right? This is the case that, again, sort of you have this typical sort of enterprise stuff. There's some sort of identity as a service. This might be part of your service. This might be Ping1. This might be Azure identity services. It might be Salesforce.com stuff. Doesn't matter. It's some sort of identity as a service. And then it cross provisions into the service 1 or service 2, 1 or 2. And then all of these guys, all they know about the identity and the trust is this. They don't know what's behind it. This might behind the scene go to the enterprise and get provision and deal with it totally behind your scene. You don't even know about it. It totally abstract that knowledge. And there are basically enough protocols and solutions exist to actually fully implement this. And this is, again, a very common thing that's out there today. So double clicking on this guy, you essentially get to a point of, I talked about the fact that you have multiple services anyways, right? I haven't seen a company that only has one service these days anymore. So you typically have a whole bunch of services, and the only way that you can actually make this stuff sane, and I talked again to some of you guys during the sort of, before the talk started, the only way that you can actually manage this stuff is to abstract and externalize that notion of identity, the authentication, the entitlements, and the authorization away from the individual applications and roll it into a single entity. Again, Autodesk guys, you guys are already doing some of that, or you're on the path for doing some of this stuff. But this becomes your identity as a service, and it's an internal instance of it. This becomes your bridge. This becomes your, we call it at Cisco, broker. I sort of coined that term a number of years ago, but whatever you want to call it, this becomes your abstraction layer, so that when you switch to two-factor authentication, you don't have to go and change service 1, service 2, service 3, application 1, application 2, application 3, application 10, application 15, and by the time you finish doing it, it's too late, and you already started doing three-factor authentication or whatever, right? So that abstraction is absolutely key as part of your architecture as you sort of go down this path, and you really need to sort of think about how you do that, so that these guys don't need to know how was the identity provision, how was the identity deprovision, how is it managed? Do you have a connector or not? Do you have an IDP or not? Do you manage credentials? What is the policy? What is the life cycle of the tokens? What is the life cycle of a session? You really don't want to have any knowledge of that at the service level. And you want it to sort of push down to that layer. Questions? Then the interesting case comes in, which is the hybrid. Remember when we talked about sort of, consumer and enterprise and things that are a lot more complex? Hybrid makes it even way more complex. I'm not even gonna talk about it. If there's enough interest, we can set up a separate conversation because it can chew up at least an hour or two just talking about some of the problem spaces in the hybrid. And frankly, this is the area that we haven't even have real good solutions. There's ad hoc bits. There's some work that's going on at IETF and OpenID to solve some of these problems, but not all of them are solved. Not all of them even surfaced yet. I've run into a whole bunch of these things because Cisco specifically has a lot of hybrid cases. We deploy VoIP and telepresence on-prem. We deploy WebEx in the cloud, and I get a token, and I need to use that token to access voicemail and WebEx. How the heck do I do that? How the heck do I verify it? How do I do application registration? There's a whole slew of things
And
around.
how many megabytes do you get in your voicemail box?
That's a data. I wasn't even gonna touch that. By the way, identity on the hybrid space is the farthest ahead. Data is even like eons beyond identity. That's even more difficult. And it's amazing. This is a fascinating area of the cloud, and there are very few sort of, things that actually have made progress in this space. But this is pretty hot. This is an interesting area. Okay, so we talked about a whole bunch of things. Let's talk about a little bit of technologies and protocols and how you solve some of those things. So going to the provisioning, deprovisioning, how am I doing with time? Not too bad. Behind as usual. So on the lower end, this is basically shows the organization size. Obviously, I'm leaving the sort of, consumer side away because that's self-managed. It's none of this applies to it really. On the smaller size, manual works fine, right? If you're starting a startup today, just go to Google, set up a bunch of accounts, just go and sort of, click on the UI and add 10 users, and that's all you need. You don't need to worry about anything else. But it only scales up to a certain point. That's past that, you need to worry about how am I gonna sort of manage this on behalf of 5, 10, 15, 20, 100, 200, 300. I have a customer that has 360 federation relationships with different solutions, please.
As someone who has set up internal authentication for more than one startup, I can tell you if you get it right at one employee, it's a heck of a lot easier than fixing it later.
Absolutely. I can also tell you 99% of people that set up a startup don't think of it that way.
My first startup, I didn't. It was such a pain that with my second startup, that was one of the first things I tackled.
Comes from experience, right? But exactly. When you get into 300 and above, roughly, obviously that number, none of this is fixed, it's all relative, right? But generally speaking, a few hundred users, you typically have some sort of, especially it's a legacy company. If it's a company that's been around for more than a few years, almost guaranteed, especially in the US, almost guaranteed you deployed AD because you'd also deployed Exchange. In US, 95 plus, in Europe, it's like 80% or so that have deployed AD, right? So you do need some sort of that you remember that bridge, that connector, whatever we end up calling it, that's the piece that really sort of goes in. And typically, it could go all the way up, but what I've seen personally talking to customers, when you start getting to about like 50, 40, 50,000 employees, the business rules get so complex that a connector is never enough. There's not enough logic in the connector to give them that capability, right? So it starts to become custom, and they have to do stuff to say, oh, I don't want the sales guys in this region to be sort of having access to this, or I don't want to do this or do that. So it becomes really complex, which brings up this SCIM. So SCIM was, 4 years ago, a bunch of us got together. I'll talk about SCIM later, so never mind. SCIM is an API, standard API that really deals with that provisioning problem. And you could sort of do it right from one person and start setting this up. And it could go up to scale as the largest, US Department of Defense, multi-million users that basically gives them full capability at their hands to deal with that provisioning, deprovisioning lifecycle. When it comes to authentication, again, on the low end, local credentials, I just create a password on Google, I'm good enough, that's all I need. OTP, two-factor authentication, whatnot. Again, you just set it up and it's good enough for you. On the higher end, SAML is the king. The only real solution for enterprises out there is SAML 2. There's really nothing else today. And this line, the bottom of this line, every time I give this talk, it sort of moves a little bit lower, right? 2 years ago, this was about 4,000 or 5,000 employees. 3 years ago, it was right here. Right now, I've seen tons of customers with a few hundred users that deployed IDP because they got so sick of dealing with the credentials and dealing with the sort of, the life cycle. I fired the guy, forgot to go delete his account, right? So this becomes a major thing, and this is moving forward. OpenID Connect is pretty new. Last January, OpenID Connect 1.0. By the way, OpenID Connect has nothing to do with OpenID. I know you guys use OpenID. That's totally different beast. January last year, OpenID Connect became standard. It's getting a lot of adoption, and my personal prediction is this is going to be the replacement for SAML over the next 4 or 5 years. But for now, if you're building a cloud service, if you don't have SAML, you don't have an enterprise solution, unless you are on the very, very low end of the business and deal with sort of, mom and pop shops that don't have IT, don't have a whole lot of employees. This is the guy that's in the middle, which is a different color because this is kind of shrinking on both ends. This is where you have an infrastructure on-prem, so you have an identity management, you have Active Directory, you have some sort of identity solution on-prem, but you don't have IT and knowledge to deploy your own IDP. So these are the guys that basically say, hey, I need to authenticate, I don't want to manage credentials here, and I don't have the knowledge to deploy IDP, so this is where you basically take care of authentication at the connector level. Whether it's using SAML or some other technology that you created, doesn't matter. But it's shrinking on both ends because on the lower end, it's kind of being eaten away by OpenID Connect and sort of local credentials. On the higher end, SAML is pushing down, so it's kind of disappearing. But again, if you had a product today deployed, this would really help you for the middle market that sort of doesn't have enough IT knowledge to do this. And there's a whole slew of companies like Okta, OneLogin, a ton of them that really are doing exactly, this is their sweet spot. This is the place that they're sort of entering into the market. And then authorization API, RESTful API, it's like de facto OAuth, there's nothing else. I haven't seen anything that's coming down the pipe that would compete with OAuth. OAuth 2, by the way, not 1. Question?
Just a question. Just a question on entitlements.
Yeah.
Is that typically coming through OAuth as attributes, or is that a whole other swim lane that is sort of starting to emerge but not fully there yet?
Great question. And I should really sort of modify this and sort of talk about that. So typically what I've seen and what I've done myself personally, entitlement is really sort of driven off of this because it's a provisioning problem to bring in the attributes, the group membership, the title, the department you're in, the location, whatnot, like all the attributes that bring in data about an individual paired with a policy on the infrastructure that says, if you're a member of group all employees, you're entitled to this. And as soon as your role changes, your group membership, your location, your title, your organization, whatnot, changes that sort of in a dynamic fashion. So it's basically a combination of this plus the policy management, policy pieces of the identity infrastructure that really takes care of that.
Is there a commerce angle to that too, where in addition to, I mean, maybe some other attributes, so maybe that's the answer, but in addition to who you are and your attributes, you now buy something, and then that gives you additional entitlements. Would that still kind of be in the provisioning space, or does that come in through a?
It could. Typically, I haven't seen that. What I've seen the most is actually the opposite of that. So your commerce, your buying, your what is driven off of the role, so that if you move 1,000 people from engineers into marketing role, and you have a policy that says marketing gets WebEx, next month's WebEx bill is going to be 1,000 more times whatever number of dollars per month it is, so that your billing is driven off of that as opposed to the other way around. I haven't really seen cases where the billing and the sort of the number of licenses you bought drives that entitlement. It's it's typically, obviously that's not a given, but what I've seen most is the other way around. Because you really don't want sort of the billing to stop you from sort of, marketing guys getting their job done, right? You want to set a policy that says marketing gets it, and if you move people to marketing, well, guess what? Your bill is going to go up next month. And I've seen systems that are actually rich enough that when you do changes in the policy, so if you sort of, moving things around, it actually tells you the result. If you submit this, you're going to have this much impact on your billing subsystem, right? And are you okay with it, type of thing. But it could be something else.
No, it makes sense. I don't know if anyone's here from the Autodesk community. I think we're doing something different, but it's more of a purchase case where, you are who you are, but then you did some business transaction, and then we give you a bit that says, on the authorization side, I believe it comes through OAuth, you now have a key to a brand new property or something like that. It's, as much as I can, so not on the team, I can't be more specific.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about it after if anybody wants to talk about it in detail, I'm more than happy to. I still have quite a few slides to go through. Identity requirements, scale, obviously, enterprise, a few users to 1 million, 2 million is about it. Consumer, 7 billion is the population of Earth. That's pretty much the cap unless we get invaded one of these days. IoT is the one that really makes it interesting. 100 billion, 200 billion, who knows, right? That's going to be the sort of the interesting bit that's coming up.
Find that for some people?
Internet of Things, Internet of Everything, Internet of Device, well, you name it, right? The stuff that goes online. Washing machines that go online. Identity provider for enterprises, you could have your service be the identity provider, where you sort of manage the account and you create a password and credentials. That's you're the identity provider for it on behalf of the customers, obviously. On-prem, the connector, the IDP, or a cloud IDP. It's identity as a service. They signed up for Ping 1, and their sort of Ping 1 is driving the identity itself. Consumers, typically either you do it or you point to one of the social sites, and typically 3 major social sites, or if you're a specific industry, you might go somewhere else. IoT, everywhere. I mean, who knows where that thing is going? That's the interesting wild card right now. Policy, again, enterprise IT controls it, self-managed, and again, everywhere. IoT is sort of is the interesting use case these days. Users, groups, devices, and apps are the sort of the main objects that you're interested in on the enterprise side. On consumers, typically you don't have groups by definition, unless it's groups within your infrastructure, like list of friends on Facebook, for example. But users, apps, potentially, and devices, or both, or the combination. IoT is everything, users, devices, gateways that controls a bunch of devices, industrial gateways, the gateway that goes into this car, smart cars that connects to the iCAN bus and all sort of other things in the car. And then the controllers, obviously, any type of controllers. Okay, a little bit of standards around this. SCIM is one of them. I talked about it. About 4 years ago, a bunch of us got together at Internet Identity Task Force just down the road from here. Guys from your neighbor, Salesforce, us, Ping, and a few other vendors got together and said, this is crazy. We haven't had a standard provisioning since SPML, which was a disaster in mid-2000. Nobody adopted it. Everybody built it, nobody adopted it. And we really need to solve this problem. Everybody has this user creation, group creation, and APIs are all different. You have to sort of write APIs for each vendor. So we wrote a set of standards that really deals with definition of schemas for users and groups, extensibility mechanisms, and a set of RESTful APIs for managing and sort of going through the lifecycle implementation. It got pretty decent adoption. We took the work to IETF and SCIM 2.0, crossing the fingers. If ISG approves it in the next few months, SCIM 2.0 will become standard, and that's going to be the sort of the main standard for that provisioning. It started as identity management in the cloud, so it actually was called Simple Cloud Identity Management. IETF didn't like that naming, so we renamed it to System for Cross-Domain Identity Management. I don't know if you guys noticed, I had to read it because I never remembered that, even though I'm the chair of the working group, sadly. I talked about sort of a set of schemas, RESTful API, the typical CRUD operations. We have bulk operations definitions for dealing with, if you're sort of updating 200,000 records, you don't want to send, update, get back, get kind of gets crazy. Search capability, discovery endpoint for discovering the capabilities of the endpoint as well as the schema for it, schema extension specifically, and extension semantics. We have complex data model, which is kind of a departure from LDAP, so it's much richer than what LDAP gave us back in late 90s and early 2000s. And simple. It's really, literally, I mean, it was, the design criteria for us was always, if you can't do this with Perl, we screwed something up. So you can actually write scripts with Perl and do anything you want with Skim. And we sort of, even when we moved it to IETF, we anally stick with it. Like, we gotta keep it simple.
Now, is that recommended?
For scripting, absolutely, why not? I do that all the time. That's the beauty of it, right? As a developer, you want life simple. You don't want to go, I mean, those of you old enough remember ASN1 encoding. Seriously? You want that or JSON? Hopefully that answers your question. And most of you guys probably go, huh? What the hell does that mean? Schema model, it's a pretty rich semantic, and 2.0, we spent the last year and a half really working on the extensibility model to make it really rich. 1.0, 1.1 had a good sort of extensibility model, but it really didn't go far enough. We took it way beyond 1.x. So we spent a lot of time on how do you extend the schema. It's got some concrete objects for users and groups. Service provider config, this is where you discover capabilities of the schema endpoint, and the schema, that's you discover what the schema is the provider offering. So you can write intelligent, and then we added enterprise user, which is sort of driven off of the user, so it's an extension of the users. Who's your admin, who's your boss, what's your department number, those type of things, which is not part of the core extension. In our implementation at Cisco, we've gone way beyond this. We have devices, we have tenants, we have blah, 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 that we basically follow the same model. And it's really simple to get off the ground. It's easy to scale, all those things, all those kind of cloudy type of capabilities make it really, really palatable to deploy this. Operations, I talked about it, you guys can look at it later. Here's an example of a create. You do a post, you give it a set of attributes, a bearer token for the authorization, and then the response for this comes back in the form of, I created the object, the ID is the thing that the service provider namespace controls. They're the ones that provides it and give it back to you, and then you get a sort of a permanent URL for that object.
Could you talk a little bit more about the bearer token and where that comes from and how that works, or is that?
So the Skim actually doesn't define that. Skim basically ignores how you do the authentication authorization of the Skim protocol. The spec recommends using auth. So this is an example of you. What? So this is an example that it could be an auth token.
Okay.
It could be basic authentication. It could be sort of the basic HTTPR flow. You don't have to be. As I said, the spec does not define it. It recommends using auth.
So the spec only considers identity, not authentication?
The spec deals with how do you manage the identity, how do you look up, how do you modify, how do you do that, but it doesn't say how you do that authentication step. The interesting part about Skim is actually, I'm going over, and let me know if I should sort of start cutting back. Why does this keep advancing? The interesting part about Skim is it started as how do we provision from on-prem to the cloud and cloud to cloud. Those were the two use cases that we described and we basically focused on. We really didn't care about any other use cases. The amazing part is I've been hit by so many IT organizations that want to do it internally because it's so much simpler than LDAP. So it's Oracle product line is switching to Skim completely or adding Skim as an addition so that all their LDAP servers, you can actually just do Skim. It's Cisco internal IT is using Skim, and it's taking a whole different path that we never even thought of or sort of initially designed it for, which is kind of interesting. SAML, you guys probably all know, at least most of you guys probably know what SAML is. It defines a service provider, an IDP, and how does the user sort of interact when there's a trust ahead of time established between the service provider and the user. It's pretty old standard. 2.0 was standardized around 2005, but it's the king. I mean, today, if you want to do federation in enterprise, this is it. And it's typically the SSO web browser SSO profile is the one that everybody talks about. The other stuff is very low adoption. And it could be SP or IDP initiated flow, so I'm gonna skip over it. This is my personal sort of, this is an area that's a problem, right? A lot of people that are new in the identity space mix up authentication authorization, and this has caused more than cases that I can imagine that's been on the front page of newspaper as far as the breaches. So this is pretty key. So what is authentication? Authentication could be the classic Homer sitting at his keyboard typing a username and a password, right? It could be a driver's license, and yeah, if you guys, some of you guys might say that's not necessarily an authorization. That's not authentication because it also has authorization in it. But this is essentially an assertion done by a trusted entity, Springfield DMV, that says the person that holds this and has this picture is Homer Simpson, and a bunch of other attributes, assertions about that nature. You can trust it because you trust this piece of thing, and you trust the DMV, the Springfield DMV, right? This is not a best example because it's also an authorization token that says Homer can drive a Class C vehicle. So if he gets pulled over, it's actually, he's authorized to drive something. So this is a mix-up both. It could be a passport that says Homer Sanchez was issued a passport by the sort of, Mexican government and he can travel. It could be a secret handshake, right? Again, there's nothing that sort of, defines it to username password. Or my favorite, it could be some specific thing about you that identifies you, like Homer's birthmark that got him into the Stonecutters Society. Now, on the other hand, authorization is something that gives you access to something, like a hotel key. The fact that I have a hotel key in my hand does not mean that I'm Morteza that checked into the hotel. It just means that I can enter the room. That's all it means. It doesn't really mean anything else. More interesting case, valet key for the cars. If I have a key, that doesn't mean I own the car. If I have the valet key might authorize me to drive the car but not open the trunk or the glove compartment. More modern cars, it will stop me from going over 25 miles an hour or go over 20 miles of sort of distance or something. It shuts down the engine. Even more interesting, more relevant to the stuff that we're doing, room access. It can actually be remotely revoked. If you lose your home access, if you lose this, you're kind of screwed. You have to pay a sort of a penalty. Somebody that finds it can walk into the room until the locksmith comes in. You lose that, you just call the lobby and then they revoke it, right? So that's much closer to an OAuth access token. So hopefully that sort of clarified authorization versus authentication. Even major companies like Facebook has mixed them up. So this has been a major problem in this industry, mixing the two up. Typically, people kind of take authentication for authorization, and in the OAuth days, authorization for authentication. That's been disastrous. So please think of this when you write your code. I'm not going to talk about this stuff. I think most of it is covered. The only thing that worth mentioning, SAML is authentication, but there are some use cases and some extensions of SAML that does authorization. Not very commonly. Typically, it's just an assertion. It's just like that driver's license. You trust the entity that issued it, because there's crypto proof that it is done by the trusted entity, and there's some assertions. It says first name is this, identity is this, last name is this, and that's it. Or the group membership is this. But typically, authorization is not part of that token, but it's not always the case.
Question.
Please.
If I'm using OAuth 1, should I rip it out for OAuth 2?
Absolutely.
Why?
A, it's paying to actually sort of evolve it. B, nobody really supports it anymore. Pretty much everybody has gotten rid of OAuth 1.
Can you talk about the differences in security?
Offline, absolutely. It could be a long conversation. We can actually continue that conversation after the talk is done. We'll talk offline. So OAuth is OAuth 2. When I say OAuth, I mean thank you for that. Actually, OAuth means OAuth 2, not 1. OAuth came up basically because of the use case where you had your pictures on Flickr. You wanted to go to Costco and print it. The only way you could do that was to go to Costco, give it your Flickr username and a Flickr account password, and then they go on behalf of you, get it. All I wanted possible was to print 2 pictures, not to be able to go in and delete my account or change my properties and do whatever the heck I could do.
Or upload porn to your account, right?
Thank you. You're even more creative than me. You must have had more beer. This typically, by the way, this is called the 3-legged OAuth model, because there are other OAuth models as well that's not necessarily that use case. But the most common case is that 3-legged model where you want to sort of, delegate somebody to have access to some of your data on some other resource server. That's the most common case of OAuth. It's IETF standard. The core standard's been around for a couple of years now. It's been pretty much finalized for like 4 years now, but it sort of delayed in the process. There's extensions coming out that actually make it a lot more interesting, and I encourage you guys, if you're interested in OAuth, to ping me offline or sort of go look at the working group. I have a link to it at the end of the presentation. It's typically RESTful, always HTTP, HTTPS, obviously. And then it sort of, talked about the passwords. It has the notion of authorization token and potentially refresh tokens, depending on the flow that you're doing, which basically allows you to kind of, take the, get new access tokens that are expired, so refresh it and get a new one. It's not authentication, this is authorization. When you have an access token, it says nothing about who the person on the other side is. It might tell you what the application is, but it will never tell you what the user is. Be careful of that distinction. So here's how it works. I'm gonna go through it pretty quick. Homer goes to the web app and he says, oh, I wanna go to the resource server and change my avatar. So the application, the web app says, goes to the authorization server, and don't ask me how it knows about the authorization server, that's a whole different conversation. But it knows where the authorization server is and says, I need some sort of access to Homer's app to go and change Homer's avatar at the resource server. Authorization server says, I don't know who Homer is. I need to authenticate him. So he goes into some sort of authentication, whether that's username, password, it's SAML, it's anything, OpenID Connect, whatever it is. Goes to the authentication service goes to Homer's laptop and he goes, hey, buddy, authenticate yourself. I don't know who you are. Homer types in his very secure password. The authentication server checks his database and says, is this password matches whatever he created? And if the answer is yes, tells the authorization server, it is Homer. Authorization server goes back to the application. Oh, authorization server says at this point, okay, I know this is Homer. It can look at its policy and say, should I allow this? Or the most common case, especially on the consumer side, on the enterprise it's typically policy. On the consumer side, it kind of says, I need to ask you. You guys all seen it on Facebook. When you sort of, you want to play Candy Crush, it says, it pops up this thing that says, are you allowing sort of Candy Crush to post on your sort of wall all the time or not? And sort of, you say yes or no, right? So he goes to Homer and says, are you cool with this? Homer says yes. Authorization server generates an access token, potentially a refresh token, and gives it to the application server and says, here's your token. Application server sends that token to the resource server and tells it, hey, I want to change Homer's avatar. Here's an access token I got from the authorization server. Resource server goes into the authorization server and says, hey, I got this token from this guy. Is it valid? It comes back and it says it's valid, and Homer's avatar gets changed. So this is the first time. It was kind of quite long and somewhat slow, if you think of all the back and forths, right? The second time Homer comes in and says, hey, I'm bored with that picture, I want to update my picture. Goes to the web app. Web app goes into the resource server and says, I want to change it with an access token. Assuming that access token is not expired, resource server goes to the authorization. Is it okay? It's authorized, and Homer changes it to his latest blazing guy pictures from that he took. Any questions on OAuth? This is one of the 4 major OAuth flows that OAuth defines. This is the most commonly used one. And as I said, the step that we talked about where authorization server checks with Homer, typically on the enterprise side is policy driven, not the user. The user doesn't typically answer questions in the enterprise side. It's IT that says, you're an engineer, you're allowed this authorization or not. OpenID Connect, I'm not gonna get into this one, that's a whole separate conversation. Key takeaway, it's not OpenID, it has nothing to do with OpenID other than the name, the beginning of the name, that's the same. I know you guys are actively using OpenID, seriously go look at OpenID Connect. OpenID is becoming deprecated pretty much by everybody. If it's like Google deprecated it, and a whole bunch of other vendors are also deprecating it. So rethink using OpenID itself. 2 is not bad. If you're using 1, it's got security flaws. 2 is there's no security flaws, but it's really nothing compared to sort of Connect as far as capabilities and semantics that it has. It basically builds on top of OAuth. So think of OAuth as a framework. This builds an identity solution based on that framework. It adds identity tokens, session management, user endpoint, all sort of other capabilities, discovery for finding things. It adds all sort of notions on top of it to make it a full-fledged end-to-end identity solution. It's very rapidly getting adoption. Salesforce fully supports it. Azure is fully supporting it. Obviously, Google and Facebook support it. Well, Facebook's partially supports it, but there's a whole bunch of vendors. Almost all the identity management products that are on-prem, either they already have support in the latest releases they have, or it's on their roadmap. So this is going to be most likely be the replacement for SAML over the next few years. Okay, a few more sort of, just random bits of things. SLA. If you have a product that has 5.9 SLA requirements, your identity system at minimum needs to have 5.9s. You guys are going to be in front of the VP, SVP, CEO, whatever, when identity system fails. Trust me, I know. So you need to make sure that this thing is redundant, it's reliable, it's highly available. All the things you can do to make a service available, you must do it for the identity, and it needs to be as good as everything else. And trust me, even when the other things don't work, the blame comes on you, and you have to be able to have enough analytics and data to prove that it's not my problem. And trust me, I'm speaking of experience and pain and all late nights and dealing with pouring through logs and whatnot. Please, question.
You'll have to forgive me because I come from the marketing side, but they let me in here anyway.
Welcome.
One of the things that we're saying for the cloud service I'm representing is that 99.995 is what you get with cloud applications. But you're saying 5.9s is now the standard?
I use that as an example.
Oh.
It depends on what you do, right? It depends on what the application is, what the service is, and what you're trying to do. My point was, whatever the service, the product that whatever SLA you have for the product, the SLA for identity has to be at least minimal, to equal to that or better, because it's foundational piece. It's just like your network. If your IP network stops working, it doesn't matter how reliable your application is. Same thing, right? It's infrastructure that everything is built on. The flow I had with Homer, if any of those sort of pieces here weren't working, you're done, right? You can never change that avatar. Doesn't matter if the avatar system is up. You can never sort of change it. Usability is key. Identity itself will never sell your product. Some of the identity features might help you push the sale, but identity doesn't sell. Identity is not what the customer doesn't buy identity. The customer buys the product. It's necessary evil that you have to build, which is unfortunately the story of our lives, right? People that are in this industry, we're always the plumbers, not the sort of the guys that sort of taste the glory. But reality is, but the problem is usability is absolutely key. How many of you guys have downloaded an app, gone to a website, tried to do something, and after the third, fourth question and the pieces of information that they tried to ask you, you said, you know what, screw it, I'm not going to do this, right? So this is the thing that turns your users off. It's not going to turn them on, but it's going to turn them off if you don't do it right. So you've got to be very careful of your usability issues. And the key thing there is analytics. You need to know how many times users come to your app, your application, your server, and walk away before finishing those steps, so you can go and adjust it. And the other thing that's absolutely important, what was acceptable yesterday might not be acceptable tomorrow. So you always need to evolve. It's always changing. What users, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds think is acceptable to sign up for something, 5 years ago it might have been totally different. Question?
But it also can go in the other direction, because I can tell you, my business is credit cards, and when I started it, we had
Again,
So it goes in both directions.
acceptable changes over time, right? It's not, you're right, absolutely, but you have to really think about this. This is the part that a lot of projects fail, because they come up with some idea and they just so dead into that sort of notion, and they miss the ball, the fact that users are just walking away. So you lose the users every day if it goes this way. I shamelessly stole this from Mark's slide deck from last year's CIS. I was gonna put something together and I thought his was much better, so I kind of used that. And the fact that I'm lazy also helped. This is the real sort of reality. There is no security is not binary. There is absolutely nothing in this world that's secure. Anything in this world, if you put enough effort and dollars into it, you can break into it. There is absolutely nothing as absolute security. It's a continuum. And the question is, what is it for your app? What is it for your infrastructure? What is it for your service? That's absolutely key, right? If the security for, again, my example of the blog site, somebody adding comments on a blog site is very different than $1 million transaction, right? So this is the thing where sort of, cost and complexity and usability suffers and the costs go up versus the identity assurance that you go. So you need to figure out what is the sweet spot for your product and sort of, build that much into it and no more. Same thing, session duration, the policies around the session. Sort of, the longer the session is, the less security you would have. Again, there's a sweet spot. Imagine if every time you wanted to sort of, go to your message on your message app on your phone, you have to type in a password. Well, that actually would be a cool thing for my kids, because that would drop them from using 8,000 or 9,000 messages per month to probably a few, but it really sort of, it changes your use pattern.
But it also has the side effect that you're much more likely to choose a one-character password.
Well, you can always solve that by putting sort of, complexity rules and whatnot, right? Actually, I should have added that password sort of to my talk as well. Anyways, a few other things. This is the last slide, promise. Yes. Risk-based stuff is the most, not new, but last couple of years, there's been a lot of sort of new innovations in that space. This is where you sort of take, what is your security requirements, and you look at the transactions and the authorization, and sort of, you look at it and say, hey, you haven't been around, but you're just trying to join a WebEx session, and you still have a token that's valid, and you're from the same IP address as last week. What the hell, I'll let you in. You're an IP address from Russia, and you're trying to do $1 million transactions, and I haven't seen you before. You know what, I think I'm gonna ask you for a little bit more sort of, authentication, a little bit more verification stuff, right? And sort of, Google has taken this to a whole different world, right? They look at your Gmail account and sort of, see that you bought tickets for London, so tomorrow if you show up in London, they actually allow you to access, and if you didn't have the ticket, they ask you to be authenticated, right? So there's all sort of analytics, all sort of things you can do with metadata that sort of helps you with that risk-based decision on the security, and that's very interesting stuff that's a lot of people are working on. Don't forget devices and app identities. That's again, it really sort of, especially with the mobile apps, it really brings everything together, and it's key. If you forget that piece of it, you're gonna have problems down the road. If you have multiple services, you have to deal with the service identities, because you remember in that picture where you have multiple services, those services might need to access each other's data, and you have to, like internally within the system, you still have to do it, and you don't want to do a different system, a different architecture for dealing with those internal type of authorization and security. So you really need to be able to deal with the service identity within your own infrastructure, and their own entitlements, obviously. Don't forget anonymous cases. I know we talked about all the identity authentication, blah, 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 and then anonymous is opposite of it, but you still, a whole bunch of apps have to deal with guest accounts, have to deal with anonymous identity. And you have to think of it ahead of time. You can't just say lack of like a token does not necessarily mean anonymous, because there are other issues that pop up if you do that. Session distribution. Do you really need your sessions to sort of, live across data centers if you have multiple data centers? What are the use cases? What are the usability? What are the pros and cons? So think about those cases as well. And I'll shut up. Question?
A question about federated identity. I'm loud. Right, yeah, I can be plenty loud.
Go ahead. I can be louder.
We federate today with a handful of services like
Facebook and Twitter, but we have thousands of software partners, so we potentially would federate with thousands of software partners. Any advice? Google does this every day, but I know folks here get nervous.
You have the right to be nervous. The trust relationship management is one of the one of the big costs of doing this infrastructure. It's hard, and if any of those trusts expire and you don't manage it, you really pay for it. So it is costly, it is a burden, and you best I can say is automation, monitoring, and analytics to help you with that. You want alarms to go off before those certificates expire. You don't want to wait until, oh shit, people can't log in type of problem, or cross-authentication or federations break. You want to be able to capture it a few months ahead of time, start dealing with it. Automation is really the answer. Some of the newer technologies will have less of a burden in managing the trust relationships, but it's never going to go away. As long as you have federation, you have to manage that federation. Sorry, no good answer, but I mean, as you said, automation is the key. Please.
We talked a lot about creating Google, Facebook, those companies for authenticating, but
Shouldn't we be weary trusting them for authentication because such a big source of their revenue is from tracking our activities through authentication?
You're absolutely right. Privacy is a big issue. Every time you talk federation or you do the delegation, because pretty much with most of the technologies out there are some solutions that solve some aspects of it, that try to bring in anonymity into the process of that delegation, but SAML doesn't. Once you use SAML federation between two, they know that person came into your service at this date and did this. Well, not what they did, but they know that they came to your service. So, and they know which URL they went to, right? So you're right, it is a privacy concern. Again, it really depends on your product. These are the decisions that really you need to sort of think about. I mean, we covered things that you probably, if you're designing an identity system, this broad topic will probably be a couple of months of design questions, thinking about each one of those aspects of it, right? We covered it in an hour. So there's a lot of thinking that needs to be done, and you're absolutely right, privacy is a major issue. And frankly, we haven't, again, as an industry, we haven't really solved some of these problems. We haven't solved the sort of, the privacy issues well. There's a whole bunch of work that's going on. That's a good news, but its adoption hasn't really taken off. There's the attribute exchange stuff, there's Kentaro project, there's a whole bunch of things that are happening in the industry to solve some of these things, but for the most part, with today's technologies, yeah, you have that risk.
As a follow-up to that question, Google, Facebook, Twitter monetize your identities. That's what they do, and they provide identity services. Is there an identity provider that has a different business model? I was hoping Mozilla Persona would catch on because they were pretty independent, and some of our customers liked that idea, but they seem to have not really caught traction.
Certainly Mozilla is one of them. There's also for hire identity as a service places where you can, Ping One. Their whole business model is around providing your identity as a service. And as such, you can demand as part of the contract negotiations, SLA, that, hey, you can't monetize, you can't share my data, whatever, right? You can use Force.com identity service. They're more of a business catered to an enterprise, so they're a lot less likely to take advantage of that data. But when you go into this free service, somebody is making money off of the data one way or another, right? So yeah, you're absolutely right. Again, it sort of goes back to the privacy. So these are all the, as I said, it really, you need to think about what is the right thing for your business, for your application, for your service, and what are the pros and cons, and what is the impact on your customers, on your business, on your product. Those are the trickier parts of that, some of those decisions. That's not just technology, that's business. You need to understand it. You need to understand what the impact is on your customers. And things change. What was acceptable a few years ago? What was the level of like metadata sharing, privacy stuff? Has changed quite a bit over the last few years, right? So, and it's gonna change even more. So it is an evolving thing and you need to deal with it. Questions?
My question is about hybrid consumer enterprise identities.
Mm-hmm.
So have you come across scenarios where a system, an identity system, performs different authorization depending on whether you're logging in using your Facebook ID versus your enterprise ID? So in that Dropbox example you gave us, Dropbox, I sign up at Dropbox using my personal ID and I have certain access, and Autodesk also gives me Dropbox access, and I log in using my Autodesk ID into Dropbox. So how do you manage the different access depending on how I log into Dropbox?
So typically the authorization is done internally to that service. So that's one of the areas that OAuth is new work in OAuth is being done so that authorization can be done centrally instead of, because right now when you do these federations, you authenticate against Box, but Box is the OAuth sort of authorization server. You don't actually give it token, access token from Ping or your on-prem infrastructure to Box and say use this token. You do the SAML identity assertion, you do the authentication, and then internally it's a Box's authorization server that's actually making the authorization decisions, right? So at that point, it's basically already made the split between is this a personal account or is this an enterprise account, which policies apply to it, right? If your question is around how do we solve the other problem, that's something that there's a lot of active work is going on. There's a whole bunch of work going on the medical space, especially because you have all these use cases where my doctor ordered an X-ray, and I want to be able to authorize myself to go look at the X-ray or get the X-ray and give it to the doctor, and they're different entities, and if each one of them has its own authorization server, you have a nightmare on your hand. So there is this project called Blue Button that's trying to solve that. The OAuth client registration work that we did at IETF recently, that's right now gone to ISG, hopefully it becomes standard pretty soon. We actually spent a year derailing that project, that is standard, to deal with some of those use cases so that we have this notion of a software assertion, that you can build an app with a software assertion that says this is an app for Cisco collaboration, and then it goes into the authorization server, so it could be customer's authorization server, self-register, get an app ID, and then sort of request access token. So there's some work going on to solve some of those, what I call, it's not the right term, so please don't quote me on it, but what I call is OAuth federation or authorization federation. That's kind of, we're building the building blocks for it, but there's still a whole bunch of work that needs to be done in that space. Question?
So I would go back to the notion of trust. Authentication, authorization, it all ties back to, do you trust that user when you authorize them or you create provision identity for them? You're establishing a trust relationship with the identity provider and the user. In current situation, that trust is somewhat static. It remains static. It's very difficult to do the changes of the authorization model in the back end and then dynamically provision their access space in the network. Do you see a shift where that static trust model moves more to a dynamic trust model and use of languages like extendable access control markup language to see what user is doing, what they're asking for, where they're coming from, and all that?
You really don't want me to talk about Xactimol, trust me. I'm not sure I understand the question though.
The question was the identity systems. Current identity system is very dynamic, very static in nature. The trust relationship is very static.
Right.
With how the identity is and the device use of different identities across the board, shouldn't we be moving towards a more dynamic trust model?
You still need, whether it's dynamic or static, you still need to build that trust relationship, right? Even whether it's dynamically created or static, you still have to be able to say, do I trust that entity that I'm going to go to get some sort of assertion statement about this user or user's attributes or whatnot, right? So can solve it using what we've done with the certificate chain and the root chain and sort of, that whole sort of, certificate model. We can solve it with the point-to-point, which we have on the SAML side right now, or other things. But you still have to have that trust, right? Somehow you need to be able to establish and say, if I'm going to her for sort of, my identity needs and I'm getting certain amount of attributes, I need to know who she is, and I need to know what level of trust I can give to what comes back from her, right? So somehow you need to be able to sort of have that. Either it's a trust anchor, it's a hierarchical trust anchor, or it's a one-to-one thing, but it has to be in place. So I'm not sure how you would sort of, bypass that, right?
So, so I'm, when I say this, I'm more interested from the identity side, not from the user side. So identity has to establish that when I'm giving you access, I have established that this is the person you are.
The authentication piece of it.
Yeah, the authentication piece and the access control, what you're requesting is appropriately provisioned, or you have appropriate access.
But that's my point, right? I don't know how to authenticate you. I know nothing about you. I don't even know how you're supposed to be authenticated. All I know is that she knows how to authenticate you. But that trust needs to be in place so that I can go to her and say, somebody's trying to use me, my service, can you tell me who this is? And then sort of she comes back to me. She does whatever it is between sort of, your endpoint and her endpoint, and sort of whether it's Kerberos, whether it's two-factor authentication, whether it's, your face, your fingerprint, whatever, I don't care. All I know is that I can trust her. I know nothing else about that system, right? So again, that trust could be hierarchical, like certificate, and sort of having a sort of a root anchor, which we've seen how that fails. It's blown up in our faces multiple times over the last few years. Or it could be a one-to-one type of thing. Or it could be the true federation, which is actually not what we use typically today. By the way, if we're over time, please let me know and we can sort of take this offline.
We're good.
2 minutes?
Yeah,
Okay,
we're
2
good.
minutes. What we do today is this very sort of, static notion, but federation actually started in a totally different model. Federation, that's like the grandfather of SAML was this automotive network that we actually set up with I can't remember the name of it right now, it escapes me, which was basically a true federation. Everybody trusted each other, and it was a sort of a collection of these entities that were part of this network, right? The educational system has that today, and it's very active. They have 5,000, 6,000 members in that federation, and as soon as somebody joins the federation, everybody else trusts it, so you don't have to have a one-to-one, you just have to have entry into the federation, and then sort of, it's typically what we do right now is a one-to-one, which is not what it actually was created for, but what's sort of the use cases kind of drove it to. But there are cases that you can solve and make it a little bit better, so that all you need to know is this person a member of an educational system that part of this federation? I don't need to know that direct relationship. I just need to know that, oh, it's McMaster.ca versus Duke.edu, right? And I'll just want to sort of be able to do some sort of business, and the business are all spelled out as far as what I can exchange between them, right? So you still have the anchor. You still have to solve that trust problem one way or another. And that's one of the problems that we have to sort of come up with better solutions, especially as we scale things and we do IoT stuff. Every technology that we built so far is going to fail when we start talking about IoT, because it just doesn't scale to that level. It's not manageable. It's impossible to do. So it's an exciting field to be in, guys. There's a lot of problems that need to be solved, and it's interesting. So thank you very much. And before I go, by the way, thank you. I just wanted to thank the organizers. This by far was the most professionally set. I mean, audio, clicker, video, seats all organized. Thank you for all the organizers. I'm gonna read it. Danny, Peter, Deborah, Lindsay, and John. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate it. We'd love your feedback. If there's other topics you want to see covered, etc., reach out to us on meetup.com, and we'll set it up. Thanks a lot. Have a
And
good
I'll
night.
post these, and I'll put a link. I'll post them online and put a link on the meetup. There's a bunch of resources at the end for places where you can dig up more information. You have my contact. Any questions, feel free. I love this stuff. I'd be more than happy to have a beer and talk about it.
Thank you, Morteza. Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.